The 4th of July in Dust Hollow, Texas, had always been the same kind of stubborn, sun-baked celebration that small towns cling to like driftwood. Not because anyone had reinvented it, but because nobody had the nerve to change it. The same carnival booths, the same overpriced lemonade, the same kids running in circles until somebody's mother screamed their name across the park. And anchoring all of it, the way it had anchored every Independence Day for going on 32 years, was the 400-yard shoot, 400 yards. That was the distance between the shooter's bench and a circular steel plate, roughly the size of a dinner plate, bolted to a post out in the open pasture east of town. The rules were simple enough that they'd never needed to be written down. One shot, one rifle of your own choosing, no wind readings from electronic devices, no spotters, no assistants. Just you and whatever patience God had seen fit to give you. The shooter who came closest to center won a gold-plated belt buckle, a handcrafted Winchester from Harlan Webb's gun shop, and the kind of bragging rights that passed from father to son in towns like this. In 32 years, nobody had ever hit it, not even close. Oh, there'd been some impressive misses. Calhoun Pickett once got within 8 inches back in the late 90s, and people still talked about it like it was scripture. But the plate itself had never rung. The wind in that particular pasture did things that couldn't be predicted with a chart or a prayer. It came off the ridge to the northwest, caught a low saddle in the hills, and by the time it crossed 400 yards of open Texas scrub, it had developed opinions of its own. Old-timers called it the devil's breath. Younger people with college degrees called it a convergence zone. Either way, it made that steel plate about as reachable as something on the moon, which is exactly why Dalton Mercer loved this day more than Christmas. He was 34 years old, broad in the shoulder, the way men get when they've never had to apologize for taking up space. And he had the kind of effortless confidence that looks like charm until you've known someone long enough to see the edge underneath it. Dalton ran Mercer Ranch, 3,000 acres of prime hill country land his grandfather had built, and his father had expanded. And he wore that inheritance the way some men wear expensive cologne. You couldn't miss it, didn't need to be told. It just arrived with him into whatever room he entered. He'd entered the chute 6 consecutive years. He'd never won either. But that wasn't really the point. The point was the performance, the crowd, the way people turned when Dalton Mercer stepped to the bench with that custom-barreled .308 he'd had built in San Antonio. He was the event, even if he never hit the target. And he'd made sure of that year after year, the way some people make sure of things without ever having to say a word about it. By 10 in the morning, the shooter's bench, a long wooden platform shaded by a canvas canopy, was already active. The park behind it was packed. Families had set up folding chairs since 7 a.m. Some of them had driven in from Caraville and Fredericksburg. The smell of brisket from the competition pits on the other side of the park drifted in and out depending on which way the wind shifted, which today it was doing every 12 minutes or so. Hector Vega shot first. He was 28, worked as a hunting guide out of Llano County, and he'd placed second 3 years running. Hector wasn't a showman. He was the kind of shooter who went quiet before he pulled the trigger. Genuinely quiet. The kind you notice because something about it makes the air feel different. He took 11 minutes on the bench. When he finally fired, the crack of his .300 Winchester Magnum rolled across the field and out the other side of the valley like it had somewhere better to be. The spotter downrange came back on the radio. 7.5 inches, high left. People applauded politely. Hector nodded once, stood, and stepped aside without expression. A man named Bobby Pruitt shot next. Bobby was a local, known mostly for being loud at high school football games, and for once shooting a coyote at 280 yards with a pistol, an event he brought up roughly every 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the company. He fired after 3 minutes on the bench. His shot hit the fence post 6 inches to the right of the plate and left a gouge in the wood that would be there until someone replaced it. "That fence post's been asking for it," Bobby said loudly. People laughed. Bobby took a small bow. 3 more men shot before noon. None came within 14 inches of center. The wind had been moving like something with a grudge all morning. Flags along the range twitching and snapping at angles that seemed almost argumentative. Even experienced eyes had trouble tracking it. Then Dalton stepped up, and the crowd settled the way crowds do when they've agreed, collectively and without discussion, that now something worth watching is about to happen. He wore a light tan shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow. His rifle was the .308, the custom build, with a suppressor he'd added the previous fall and a scope that cost more than some people's monthly rent. He set up slowly, arranged himself behind the rifle with the fluid, practiced ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, and then he got still. Dalton was, whatever else could be said about him, genuinely skilled. He could read wind flags. He understood ballistic drift. He had the patience to wait, which is maybe 60% of the difficulty in long-range shooting. Just the waiting, just the holding of yourself in position while the world keeps moving and your body wants to breathe and your mind wants to give up. He waited 9 minutes. The flags fluttered, went still, fluttered again. He breathed out, slow. The trigger broke. The shot crossed 400 yards in just under half a second. The radio crackled. 5 3/4 inches, low right. The crowd exhaled like they'd been holding it collectively since he sat down. People clapped, some of them standing. His name moved through the crowd on the wave of that applause like it always did. Dalton stood, rolled his shoulders, and the corner of his mouth pulled up just slightly. "She's in a bad mood today," he said to no one in particular, meaning the wind. A few people close enough to hear him laughed, and he handed the rifle to the range officer with the practiced ease of a man who'd already decided he'd had a good morning, regardless of the outcome. He was back at his spot near the edge of the canopy, accepting a bottle of water from a woman named Cassidy, who helped manage the ranch when the old truck pulled into the gravel lot. It was a Ford F-150 that had seen better decades, sun-bleached, with a crack running halfway across the windshield that had been there long enough to collect dust in the seam. It parked crookedly, the way someone parks when they're not entirely sure their body is going to cooperate with the geometry of the space available. The engine ticked for a long moment after it cut off, and then the driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was 71 years old, and he moved like 71 felt, not with the performance of frailty, but with the honest, deliberate carefulness of a body that had taken real damage over a long time and had learned to negotiate the terms. He was tall, still, though the height had settled into him differently than it probably once had. Lean. A face that had been out in sun for most of 7 decades, with the kind of lines that aren't from worry, but from squinting against brightness. His hair was white and cut close. He wore a plain cotton shirt, dark jeans, and boots that had been resoled at least once. From the passenger side came a teenager, maybe 16, 17, who moved with that particular combination of self-consciousness and restless energy that only exists for a few years, right at the hinge between boyhood and whatever comes after. He was wearing a baseball cap and had his grandfather's same long-limbed build, though on him it still looked accidental, like he hadn't grown into it yet. "Granddad, you really don't have to do this," the boy said as they came around the truck. "Levi," the old man said without looking at him, "I'm just saying, I know what you're saying." The old man's voice wasn't harsh. It was the kind of calm that comes from a long way past the point where raising your voice seems useful. Levi pulled his cap down lower and fell into step behind him. Their arrival did not cause an immediate stir. People noticed the truck because it stood out among the newer vehicles in the lot. They noticed the old man because of the way he walked, not limping exactly, but with that unhurried, deliberate quality that can look like arrogance from a distance and like something else entirely up close. A few people recognized him. Dust Hollow had about 4,000 residents and the kind of communal memory that makes small towns feel intimate and suffocating in roughly equal measure. "Is that Gideon Mercer?" someone said, not quietly enough. "Gideon Mercer? I thought he moved off the County 5 6 years ago. Came back about 2 years ago, lives out on his son's old place. Or what's left of it." The name moved through the crowd in that low murmur that means something without quite saying it. Because Gideon Mercer's name in Dust Hollow had a particular quality to it, the kind of name that carries something attached to it, like a hook in still water. People in this town had said things about Gideon Mercer for years. Some of it was rumor. Some of it was the kind of story that starts as a rumor and calcifies over time into the texture of established fact, the way limestone forms, slowly, layer by layer, until it's hard enough to build on. The story, as most people in Dust Hollow knew it, was this. Gideon had been a soldier once, a long time ago, and whatever had happened over there, the specific conflict blurred in the retelling, as these things do. He had not comported himself with the dignity the occasion required. The word coward had been attached to his name long enough that people had stopped noticing it was an accusation and had started treating it like a descriptor, the way you'd say someone was quiet or heavy-set. Nobody could tell you exactly where the story came from. Somebody's father had said something to somebody's uncle, and from there it had spread with the quiet, efficient devastation that only happens in small towns where people have known each other long enough to believe the worst things about familiar faces. Gideon himself had never addressed it, not once, as far as anyone knew. He just moved through Dust Hollow when he was here, with that unhurried quality, and said nothing. which, in a town like this, people had taken as confirmation. He walked directly to the registration table where Earl Mobley sat with a clipboard, a styrofoam cup of coffee, and the weary expression of a man who had been organizing this event for 11 years and had long since stopped expecting to be surprised. "Gideon," Earl said. His tone was carefully neutral, which is its own kind of message. "Earl." Gideon looked at the registration sheet. "What's the entry?" $15, but Gideon," Earl hesitated. "You're clear on the rules? One shot, your own equipment. No, same rules as always," Gideon said. "They haven't changed, have they?" "No, sir." Gideon put $15 on the table in cash, 3 fives, exactly, and wrote his name on the sheet. His handwriting was slow and deliberate, like a man who does things once and does them to last. Levi watched from 2 steps back, hands shoved into the front pocket of his hoodie. Earl handed over the waiver form. Gideon signed it without reading it, which Earl found either brave or alarming. He stamped the form and handed over a yellow competitor's tag. "You're last up, then. Should be about 40 minutes." Gideon nodded and turned from the table. It was then that someone nearby got their first clear look at what the old man was carrying. The rifle was in a worn canvas case, the kind with a leather-reinforced handle and a zipper that probably hadn't been fully smooth in a decade. When Gideon set it down on one of the waiting benches and unzipped it partially, just enough to confirm everything was in order, the man standing 3 feet away got a look at the barrel, and his eyebrows went up. Is that a .22? The question wasn't quiet. Questions like that never are. The man said it loud enough for the 4 people next to him to hear, and from there it moved outward in ripples, the way things do in crowds. "He's got a .22. A .22 for 400 yards? You can't hit a plate at 400 yards with a .22 rabbit rifle. That's not possible." It started with a few scattered laughs, genuine surprise laughs, not mean ones, the kind that come from the sheer absurdity of a proposition. But those laughs found each other across the crowd, and what starts as a handful of people reacting to the same thing becomes, very quickly, a wave. By the time Gideon zipped the case back up and sat down on the bench to wait, there were people laughing who hadn't even seen what the gun was. They were laughing at the laughter, at the energy of it, at whatever it was that was so obviously worth laughing about. Levi sat beside his grandfather, his jaw tight. He was looking at his shoes. "Granddad," he said quietly, "they're laughing at you." "I know," Gideon said. "So why are we just sitting here?" "Yes." Gideon turned and looked at his grandson for a moment, not with the look of a man who's suppressing something, not with the patient resignation of someone who's used to being mocked, with something that was closer to genuine calm, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. "Because we're waiting our turn," he said. "That's what you do." Levi looked back at his shoes. He didn't say anything else. The next 40 minutes proceeded with the kind of noise that belongs to summer events in small Texas towns. Kids running, a country station playing from somewhere near the food stands, the sporadic crack of rifle fire from downrange, and beneath all of it, underneath the normal texture of the afternoon, the persistent low murmur of the crowd that had gathered specifically to see what the old man with the .22 was going to do. Some people drifted away. Most stayed. There's something about the possibility of witness, of being present for something, even if you can't say exactly what, that holds people in place even when they tell themselves they have somewhere better to be. Hector Vega moved to a spot along the roped-off observation area, close enough to see. He'd been watching the old man since he arrived, with the careful, precise attention he applied to things that didn't immediately make sense to him. Hector was not a man who laughed easily. He stood with his arms crossed and watched Gideon sitting on that bench, and he didn't say a word to anybody. Wyatt Boone found a spot about 20 feet from Hector. Wyatt was 23 years old from a town called Marble Falls, and had finished the morning's competition in the middle of the pack, 12 inches from center, which wasn't embarrassing but wasn't notable either. He had a naturally narrow, intense face, the kind that looks like it's always calculating something, and he'd been shooting competition since he was 13. He was not famous. Not yet. But he had the kind of fundamental competence that serious people recognize immediately and ambitious young people spend years trying to develop, and he knew enough to know when something in front of him was worth paying close attention to. He watched the old man sitting on the bench. He watched the way Gideon's eyes moved, even sitting still, not darting, not restless, but tracking. Reading the flags at the far end of the range. following the dust that lifted off the scrub on the hillside east of the plate and moved in directions that didn't quite match what the flag said. Watching the way the grass in the middle distance lay flat, then briefly lifted, then lay flat again. "Hey," Wyatt said to the man beside him, a stranger in a blue polo shirt who'd come from wherever the blue polo shirt crowd came from. "You see what he's doing?" The man squinted. "What, sitting there?" "He's reading the wind." The man in the polo shirt looked at the old man on the bench, then back at Wyatt. "With a .22? He said it the way someone says a joke, expecting the other person to complete it. Wyatt didn't answer. He was still watching Gideon, the range officer, a sunburned, no-nonsense man named Carl who'd been running this event for years, eventually called the old man's name. "Gideon Mercer, you're up." Gideon stood from the bench the same way he'd sat down, carefully, without hurry, his hand going briefly to the bench surface for balance before he straightened. He picked up the canvas case and carried it to the shooter's bench. The noise level in his crowd behind the observation rope didn't die down. If anything, it increased. There was a festive quality to it now, the kind of collective energy that happens when people have decided this moment is entertainment. Someone in the back said something that got a laugh from the people around him. Bobby Pruitt, still in the area, called out, "Give 'em hell, old-timer!" It was delivered in the specific tone that means the exact opposite, but Gideon didn't acknowledge it. He set the canvas case on the bench and unzipped it fully. The rifle that emerged was small. Not dramatically small, not a toy, but notably compact compared to the long-barreled precision rifles that had preceded it at that bench all morning. A .22 LR bolt action, the kind of rifle that gets sold in hardware stores, that fathers use to teach their kids to shoot tin cans in the backyard. The scope on top of it was the most expensive thing visible on the whole package, a quality glass, well-maintained, but still attached to a gun that most serious shooters would use for plinking at 50 yards. The laughter hit a new peak. Not all of it was mean. Some of it was the honest laughter of disbelief, the kind that means I cannot believe what I am actually seeing. Carl, the range officer, looked at the rifle, looked at Gideon, and kept his face professionally blank. "Ready when you are." "Give me a minute," Gideon said. Carl nodded. Gideon sat down behind the rifle. He settled his elbows onto the bench, adjusted the position of his body by small increments, the kind of adjustments that take years to know how to make and can't really be explained. Then he looked through the scope, not with the intensity of a man trying to will a bullet to its target, but with the patience of someone who is content to look at a thing for as long as it takes. The crowd did not settle. "He's going to be waiting a while," someone said. "Wind's been jumping all morning." "He's going to wait all afternoon, and it's not going to matter," someone else replied. "A .22's got, what, about half the velocity? It'll be drifting 3-4 feet before it gets there. This isn't a thing." "Then why are we still watching?" a woman's voice asked. Nobody answered that. 2 minutes passed. Then 3. The crowd noise shifted, not quieter exactly, but with a different texture to it. Less like mockery, more like uncertainty. There is a quality to genuine stillness that's hard to perform, and Gideon was not performing it. He was in it. He sat behind that rifle like something geological, like something that had always been there and wasn't planning to be anywhere else for a while. 5 minutes, 6. Dalton Mercer had come back to the observation area, his water bottle in hand. He watched for a minute, then 2. He found himself watching the flags along the range the way the old man was presumably watching them from behind the scope. He found himself thinking, without quite meaning to, about the particular problem of a .22 at 400 yards. The bullet was smaller, lighter. It would shed velocity faster. It would be affected more dramatically by crosswind. Not less. Dramatically more. To compensate, a shooter would need to hold off target by a margin that made intuitive aiming essentially impossible. And the wind today wasn't steady, wasn't even close to steady. He was thinking about this when he noticed Hector Vega beside him. "What do you think he's doing?" Dalton asked, because he was curious enough to ask, and because Hector Vega's opinion on technical shooting matters was worth having. Hector was quiet for a moment. Then, "Waiting for something specific." "What do you mean?" "The wind's been jumping all morning, but it jumps in patterns, mostly. If you watch long enough..." Hector paused. "He's not waiting for a good window. He's waiting for a specific window." Dalton looked at the old man on the bench. "With a .22. "With a .22, Hector confirmed. His tone was not dismissive. 10 minutes. The crowd had grown. Word had spread through the park in the way it always does. Not through announcement, but through curiosity, through people asking the person next to them what's going on, and that person saying, just come watch, and then both of them staying because something about the quality of attention in the crowd was communicating that this was a thing worth seeing. People who'd been at the brisket competition had wandered over. A group of teenagers who'd been on the carousel found their way to the observation rope. Even the woman running the lemonade stand had handed off to her daughter and drifted over. The atmosphere had changed. The laughter was mostly gone. Not replaced by respect. Not exactly. People hadn't processed enough yet to get to respect. It was something more primitive than that. Attention. Pure animal attention. The kind that doesn't need a reason. Just the sense that something is happening. Wyatt Boone hadn't moved from his spot. He was watching the wind flags and watching the old man and running calculations in his head. Not precise ones, but the kind of instinctive ballistic feel that serious shooters develop. His mouth was a flat line. "Excuse me," he said to the woman beside him, and then he pushed gently through the crowd toward the edge of the observation rope, where he could see the range more clearly. 12 minutes. Levi was standing behind the observation rope, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a complicated intersection of anxiety and something that might have been the beginning of awe. He wasn't sure what he was looking at. He'd seen his grandfather shoot before. Targets at the ranch, nothing competitive, nothing like this. He'd never understood what exactly his grandfather was doing when he went quiet like this. It had always seemed like just waiting to him, pointless, extended waiting. He was starting to reconsider that assessment. "Your grandfather," said a voice beside him. Levi turned. It was an older man he didn't recognize, heavy-set, with a white mustache and the bearing of someone who'd spent significant time in uniform without needing to advertise it. He was watching the bench with an expression that was hard to read. "Yes, sir," Levi said. "How old is he?" 71. The man nodded slowly. "He looks good." "He's okay," Levi said. "His knee's bad. His left shoulder—" He stopped, not sure why he was telling a stranger this. "I wasn't talking about his health," the man said gently. Levi looked at him, then back at the bench. 13 minutes. 14. The crowd was almost fully quiet now. Not the quiet of boredom, the opposite. The quiet of a room when something fragile is being handled. People had stopped talking about whether this was possible. They'd stopped most of the commentary entirely. They were just watching. Bobby Pruitt had also gone quiet. He was toward the back of the crowd, and the easy joke had drained out of him somewhere around the 11-minute mark, replaced by something he couldn't quite name, which was its own kind of unsettling. Carl, the range officer, stood to the side of the bench at the distance that protocol required, his radio in hand. He'd timed contestants before. He'd had people sit for 20 minutes and then miss by 3 feet. But there was something about the quality of this particular waiting that made him check the radio twice to make sure the channel was open. 15 minutes. 16. The flags at the far end of the range went through a sequence Gideon had been tracking for the better part of an hour before he even walked to the bench. He'd been watching from the moment they arrived, from the observation area, from the bench while he waited, tracking the pattern in the wind's irregularity. Which sounds like a contradiction, but patterns and irregularity exist, the way the gaps between waves and water aren't random. The way turbulence in air has a structure that can be seen if you look long enough and are willing to look without expectations. There was a window, not a still moment. There wouldn't be a still moment today, but a window in which the cross component of the wind would drop below a threshold that mattered, and in which the angular drift would be predictable enough to account for. It wasn't a wide window. It would last maybe a second and a half, maybe 2. And it was coming. He could feel it at the pattern the same way old sailors feel weather and pressure changes. Not mystically, not magically, but through the accumulated experience of having paid attention to the same kinds of phenomena for 50 years. His finger settled on the trigger. The weight of the pull was something he'd known for so long it was like the weight of his own hand. He watched the nearest flag, watched the middle flag, watched the grass at the 200-yard mark. 17 minutes. The flag at the far end dipped, came up, dipped again. There. The .22 cracked. It was smaller than the shots that had come before it, lighter, with less of the authority that larger calibers carry. People who were expecting the percussive punch of a .308 might almost have missed it, except that the crowd was so completely silent by that point that the small, sharp crack seemed to cut all the way to the ridgeline and back. The bullet, 40 grains of lead moving at roughly 1,100 feet per second, fighting crosswind and gravity across 400 yards of Texas air, traveled in a parabolic arc that the old man had calculated not with a computer or a phone app or even a chart, but with a mind that had been doing this kind of math for 5 decades. Carl raised the radio. The range officer at the far end took a moment. Then his voice came back. Everyone heard it. Target struck, measuring. The crowd, 200 and some odd people, the largest gathering the 400-yard shoot had ever drawn, erupted simultaneously, not in applause but in the raw, uncontrolled sound of collective shock. It was not celebratory, not immediately. It was the sound of a room where everyone's chair has moved simultaneously 1 inch to the right. It was disorientation first and comprehension second. Dalton's water bottle slipped from his hand and hit the dirt. Hector Vega exhaled once, slowly, and said nothing. Wyatt Boone stood absolutely still for a moment, then let out a breath that had apparently been held for several minutes. Levi, 17 years old, standing behind an observation rope with a stranger he didn't know, felt something happen in his chest that was not a small thing. He didn't have a name for it yet. He would later. But right now he just stood there with his mouth slightly open and watched his grandfather slowly, carefully, deliberately rise from behind the rifle and straighten up. Gideon did not pump his fist. He did not turn to acknowledge the crowd. He stood, and he looked downrange for a moment, and his expression was the same expression it had been for the last 17 minutes. Carl raised his radio again. Measurement is in. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to feel like a year. 1.5 inches from dead center. The crowd found its voice. And in the back of it, somewhere, Bobby Pruitt was no longer laughing. Dalton Mercer was already moving, breaking from the crowd, ducking under the rope, striding out toward the range with the long-legged urgency of a man who needs to verify something with his own eyes. 400 yards. He ran most of it. The heat of the July afternoon pressed down on him like something with weight, and he ran through it, past the midfield marker, past the 250 post, until he was standing in front of a circular steel plate that had hung unmarked for 32 years. He stood there for a long moment, looking at it. A single small divot, clean and unmistakable, punched into the face of that plate. 1.5 inches from the center ring. He put his finger on it. The steel was still warm from the sun, and the divot was the size of a large pea, and it was real. He took the radio from Carl, who had followed at a jog. He pressed the button. His voice, when it came out, was not quite the voice he'd arrived with this morning. Hit confirmed, Dalton said. 1.5 inches, it's confirmed. He turned and walked back. The walk back was different from the run out. He walked slowly. He was thinking about something, though he couldn't have told you exactly what it was yet, because it was the kind of thought that assembles itself slowly, piece by piece, from the raw material of a thing that's just happened that you weren't prepared for. He was thinking about the rifle. He was thinking about 17 minutes of stillness. He was thinking about the name Mercer and what it meant and why it mattered to him, and whether the name he'd built his identity around was the only Mercer in this pasture today. When he came back through the crowd and found Gideon standing quietly at the edge of the range, re-zipping the canvas case, Dalton stopped about 6 feet away. Gideon looked up. They looked at each other for a moment. Dalton opened his mouth and then closed it. He was not yet sure what he wanted to say. He was not sure he had the words. He'd been preparing all morning for this event to end the way it always ended, and the ending he'd received was not on any list of endings he'd prepared for. How? Dalton said finally. Just that. Not a complete sentence. Gideon finished zipping the case. He looked at the younger man without hostility, without satisfaction, without any of the triumph that Dalton would probably have displayed in the same situation. I've been watching the wind in this valley since I was your age, Gideon said. Maybe longer. He picked up the rifle case. He looked at Levi, who was now beside him, and gave a small nod. Granddad? Levi said. His voice was different than it had been 40 minutes ago. Something had happened to it. That was... Let's get some water, Gideon said. I'm thirsty. They walked away from the bench. The crowd parted for them. Not because anyone organized it, but because that's what crowds do when something has shifted in the room and people can feel it even if they haven't understood it yet. Somewhere in the middle of the crowd, the man with the white mustache watched Gideon walk past. His name was Nathan Crow, and he had been retired from law enforcement for 6 years, and he had known Gideon Mercer for a very long time. He watched the old man move through the parted crowd with that unhurried quality, and his jaw was tight, and his eyes were doing something complicated. He'd been waiting a long time to say something that needed to be said. He thought maybe today was the day. The water Gideon drank came from a paper cup that a woman at the refreshment table had handed him without being asked. The way people sometimes move toward a thing they feel they owe someone without being able to explain the debt. He drank it standing up, the way he did most things, without theater, without fuss. Levi stood beside him, holding a can of soda he hadn't opened, watching the crowd with the hyper-aware vigilance of someone who's been in uncomfortable situations enough times to always know where the exits are. The noise around them was different now. It had the quality of a room after something breaks. Not the breaking itself, but the moment after, when people are processing the gap between what they expected and what actually happened. People were talking, but in lower registers than before. Clusters of 2 and 3, heads bent together, eyes that moved toward Gideon and then moved away when they found him already looking. People keep staring, Levi said. Let them, Gideon said. It bothers me. I know. Levi cracked the soda and drank half of it in one go, which is what you do when you're 17 and don't know what else to do with your hands. He wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist. You knew you were going to hit it, didn't you, before you pulled the trigger? Gideon was quiet for a moment, turning the paper cup in his fingers. I knew the conditions were right, he said. That's not the same thing. What's the difference? Knowing the conditions are right means you've done everything you can do. What happens after that isn't yours. He set the cup down on the table. You don't ever know you're going to hit something. You just know you've given yourself the best chance. Levi thought about that. He didn't have anything to say to it, which meant it had landed somewhere that needed more time. They were standing like that, not quite at ease, not quite ready to leave, when Wyatt Boone appeared at the edge of their space. He didn't push in. He stopped a few feet away, the way someone stops when they're not sure if they're welcome, and he held himself there for a moment before speaking. Sir, he said, addressing Gideon directly. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that he wasn't entirely managing to keep out. I apologize for earlier, the crowd. He stopped. I didn't laugh, but I also didn't say anything, and I probably should have. Gideon looked at him without expression for a moment. Then something around his eyes shifted, marginally. What's your name? Wyatt Boone. I shot this morning. Marble Falls. How'd you do? 12 inches? High right. The admission came with a small tightening of the jaw, the way any honest accounting of a failure does. I read the wind wrong. I thought I had it, and I didn't. What did you miss? Wyatt frowned slightly. I'm sorry? What did you miss about the wind? What was the read you made that was wrong? The younger man was quiet for a moment, because this was clearly not the conversation he'd come over expecting to have. He'd come to apologize and perhaps to ask a question, but he'd expected pleasantries first, the social scaffolding that normally surrounds these things. Gideon had skipped all of it and gone straight to the matter. I was watching the main flags, Wyatt said slowly. The ones at the bench and the far end. I thought they were telling me the wind was running about 8 miles an hour, left to right, consistent. And it wasn't consistent. There was a second layer, lower, maybe running off the hill to the north, that I didn't catch until after I fired. It hit the bullet somewhere around the 250 mark and pushed it. He paused. I saw it in the grass movement when I was watching you. That's when I realized. Gideon studied him for a moment. How long have you been competing? 10 years, since I was 13. Your father shoot? My grandfather. My dad never got into it. Who taught you? My grandfather mostly, then a coach in Austin for a while. Wyatt's jaw shifted slightly. He was good. Better than me, probably, in his prime. He passed 2 years ago. Something in Gideon's face registered that, not sentimentally, but with the recognition of one person who's lost someone to another. I'm sorry. Yes, sir. There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, exactly. More like the pause after someone has said something real and both parties are giving it appropriate space. You were watching the grass, Gideon said. The whole time I was on the bench. It wasn't a question. Wyatt answered it anyway. Yes, sir. I was trying to understand what you were looking for. I figured if you were sitting there that long, you'd found something I hadn't. Did you find it while you were watching? Wyatt thought about it honestly. I think I found part of it, the second wind layer. But I couldn't have told you exactly when the window would open, or how long it would last. I was still guessing at that. Gideon nodded once. You weren't guessing, he said. You were estimating. Those aren't the same thing either. Wyatt looked at him. What's the difference? Guessing is random. Estimating is structured. You'd identified the right problem. You just didn't have enough data yet to solve it. The young man absorbed that. He had the kind of face that shows thinking, not performance thinking, actual thinking, where something moves behind the eyes that isn't for show. "Can I ask you something?" Wyatt said. "You can ask." The hold-off. For the wind compensation at 400 yards with a .22, where were you aiming? Gideon was quiet for a moment. This was the kind of question that has a real answer and a simple answer. And the simple answer is almost never the right one. You understand that the calculation changes depending on the window you're waiting for. "Yes, sir." When the window came, when I took the shot, the cross component had dropped. I was holding roughly 14 inches left of center. Vertical, I was holding high, compensating for drop. The scope was set for 100 yards, so at 400 I was working with a significant arc. He paused. "The exact number depends on your load, your atmospheric conditions, your altitude. I know my rifle. I know that specific load. The number I had in my head was built from about 20 years of shooting that same combination. Wyatt was doing something with his face that might have been the beginning of a smile, except he was too focused to let it complete. 20 years, give or take. I've got 10. Then you've got 10 more to go before the numbers feel like yours, Gideon said. Not unkindly, just accurately. Levi had been listening to all of this with his soda can held in two hands, and he had the expression of someone watching a conversation in a language they almost speak, understanding most of it, losing threads here and there, aware that something important is being said, even in the parts he didn't quite follow. Wyatt Boone glanced at the boy, then back at the old man. "Thank you," he said, for answering. He seemed like he wanted to say more and wasn't quite sure how. "I hope I get to see you shoot again sometime." Gideon gave him a look that was not quite a smile. "Come find me if you're ever out this way in the fall. I do some work on the North Pasture on Tuesday mornings. If you want to watch a man miss targets, I'm available." It was close enough to a joke that Wyatt produced what was close enough to a laugh. He shook the old man's hand, two-handed, the way you do with someone you genuinely mean it with, and then he moved back into the crowd. Levi watched him go. "He's good, isn't he?" the boy said. Not really a question. "He's got good instincts," Gideon said, "and he knows what he doesn't know. That second part's rarer." The afternoon was pulling past 2 o'clock now. The competition was officially over, results posted, the range officer breaking down the equipment at the bench. Most of the shooting crowd had moved toward the food area, pulled by the smell of brisket and the natural migration that happens when the main event has concluded. But a noticeable number of people had not migrated anywhere. They'd stayed in the rough vicinity of wherever Gideon Mercer happened to be, not directly approaching, but not leaving either, orbiting at a distance that felt like something other than coincidence. It was Dalton who came back first. He walked across the park with the kind of deliberate, unhurried stride that Dalton Mercer used when he needed to not look like he was hurrying, which meant he was almost certainly managing something internal that was harder than he wanted to show. He was alone. Cassidy and the other ranch people had dispersed, and he'd left his custom rifle somewhere, which was a small detail that felt larger than it probably was. Dalton without his rifle at this event was like Dalton without the easy confidence. Something was missing from the usual package. He stopped in front of Gideon with about 2 feet of air between them. "That was real," Dalton said. "I want you to know I checked it myself." "I know you did," Gideon said. "I ran out there." There was something briefly self-deprecating in the way Dalton said it, a flash of awareness about himself that he didn't usually put on display. "Needed to see it with my own eyes." "That's reasonable." Dalton was quiet for a moment, looking at the old man. Whatever he was doing with his face, it wasn't coming as easily as usual. "You've been coming to this event. How many times have you come?" "I've watched it 11 or 12 times, Gideon said, "over the years. Never entered." "Why today?" The question sat there between them for a moment. "Levi wanted to see it," Gideon said. "Thought I'd give him more than just watching." It was a simple answer, and also probably not the complete answer, and Dalton seemed to understand that from the slight pause he gave before he continued. He looked at Levi, who looked back at him steadily, neither hostile nor warm. "You're his grandson," Dalton said. "Yes," Levi said. Dalton nodded as if confirming something he'd already been told. He was quiet for another moment. "The prize," he said, looking back at Gideon. "The buckle. And the rifles. That's yours. You've earned it, more than earned it. He said it with the particular effort of a man who's choosing the honest thing over the convenient thing and finding the honest thing heavier than expected. I appreciate that, Gideon said. Something flickered across Dalton's face. It was there and then mostly gone, but not entirely. I'd like to... There's some things I think need saying, not here, necessarily. He glanced at the people still hovering in the surrounding area. But before you leave today, Gideon looked at him for a long moment. All right, he said. Dalton gave a short nod, then walked away. He walked like a man carrying something that had just gotten heavier. Levi watched him go. What do you think he wants to say? I don't know. You have a guess, though. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He looked out toward the range where the steel plate still hung in the afternoon heat, visible from here as a small gleam in the distance. I have a guess, he said. Let's go get some of that brisket before it runs out. They were in line at the pit when Nathan Crow found them. He moved through the crowd with the efficiency of someone who spent years moving through crowds without disturbing them. Not quite invisible, but close. The kind of practiced low profile that people with certain professional histories develop without quite knowing when. He fell into line behind Gideon as naturally as if they'd arranged to meet here. Gideon, he said. Gideon turned. The recognition was immediate, but the reaction was controlled. Nathan. Nice shot. Thank you. Nathan Crow was 64 years old, heavy-set in the chest and shoulders in the way that serious men from certain eras tend to be, with a white mustache that he'd had for so long, it had become simply his face. He'd retired as a county marshal 6 years ago, after 28 years in law enforcement in 2 different states. He and Gideon had a history that went back further than that, to a period of both their lives they'd discussed exactly once, in a conversation that had lasted 40 minutes and had never been revisited by unspoken agreement, until apparently today. Levi looked back and forth between the 2 old men with the careful attention of someone sensing that a room has a history he's not been read into. Levi, Gideon said, you want to go pick us a table, somewhere with some shade. Levi was 17 and perceptive enough to know when he was being asked to give adults space. He took both their plates and went to find a table, glancing back once. Nathan stepped forward and they stood together in the slow-moving line without speaking for a moment. You know why I'm here, Nathan said. His voice was low. Not secretive, just the right volume for what they were talking about. You've been waiting for an occasion, Gideon said. Something like that. Nathan, I've been quiet about it for a long time, the older man said, and his voice carried something that had been compressed. I've been quiet out of respect for you, because you asked me to be, and because I understood why at the time, but things have changed. Gideon's jaw moved slightly. Levi. He's older now. He's 17. He's hearing things in this town. Nathan stopped himself, reorganized. Somebody told his teacher, 2 weeks ago, about the story, the rumor. He said that last word with a particular dryness. And the teacher apparently mentioned it, not unkindly, but in front of the class. Some kind of discussion about local history or something, and Levi had to sit there and hear it. The line moved forward a few steps. Gideon moved with it and said nothing, which was itself information. He didn't tell you, Nathan said. No. He didn't want to upset you. I know. Nathan looked at him sideways. So you did know. I guessed. He got quiet after school about 3 weeks ago. Happens when something's bothering him that he doesn't want to bring to me. Nathan exhaled. Gideon, this has gone on long enough. You know it has. He kept his voice level, which cost him something. That boy is going to go through his life in this county with that name attached to his grandfather, and you are standing here having just shot the finest shot this event has ever seen, and people are going to go home today and somebody's going to say, yeah, but you know what they say about old Gideon Mercer, and the shot is not going to be what anyone remembers. Gideon was looking at the brisket ahead of him. He was quiet for long enough that the silence became its own kind of answer. I know, he said finally. Then let me say what needs to be said. Nathan, not about you, the older man said, and his voice got a different quality to it. Harder, clearer. About what I know, what I saw, what I was part of back then, when none of this had happened yet. He paused. I was there, Gideon. I was in a country the same time you were, different unit, but I was there for the Valley operation. I know what actually happened. The line was at the front now. A heavy-set man in an apron handed them 2 plates loaded with brisket and sides without commentary. Gideon took his plate automatically and they stepped out of the line together. "You've never told anyone," Gideon said. "No." "Why now?" Nathan looked at him directly. "Because today the whole town was here, and because you just made it impossible for them to keep not seeing you." He said it plainly, without drama. "You could have stayed home today. You came anyway. And you shot that shot, knowing what it would do." He let that settle. "I think you already made your decision. I think you've been making it slowly for a while. I think today was the last piece of it." Gideon said nothing. "I'm not asking your permission, Gideon. I want you to know that. I'm telling you what I'm going to do as a courtesy, because you're my friend and you deserve that courtesy. But I'm done being quiet about it." They walked together toward the table where Levi was sitting, the boy watching them come across the park with the kind of still attention that you develop when you've learned that the things adults don't say are often more important than the things they do. They sat down. For a minute, all 3 of them just ate. The brisket was good, properly smoked, with a bark that had the right amount of pepper in it, and the normalcy of eating was its own small mercy in the middle of everything else. Levi looked at Nathan Crow. "I've seen you before," he said, "at the hardware store. You're the one who used to be the marshal." "That's right." "You were watching my grandfather, earlier, before the shot." Nathan smiled and it moved the white mustache. "You've got good eyes." "He does," Gideon said without looking up from his plate. Levi chewed for a moment. Then carefully, "You know my grandfather from before." "Long before," Nathan said. "From the service?" Nathan looked at Gideon. Gideon set down his fork. He looked at his grandson across the table, and the afternoon light came in from the west at an angle that did something to his face, brought out the depth of the lines, the weight of the years in them, without making him look old exactly. Just long. Like a road that's covered a lot of ground. "There are things about my history I haven't told you," Gideon said. "About what I did. Before you were born. Before your father was grown." Levi put his fork down too. "I didn't tell you because—" He stopped. Reorganized. He was not a man who'd had much practice at this kind of conversation, and it showed, and he didn't try to hide that it showed. "I thought it was my past, and it didn't need to be your weight. What people say about me in this town, I figured you'd hear eventually, and I figured it wouldn't matter as much as what you actually knew about who I am." He picked up his fork again, then put it back down without eating. "I was wrong about that. I underestimated how much it would cost you. That's on me." Levi was looking at him steadily. "What did they say? The teacher? At school? What did she say about you?" Gideon's expression didn't change much. "What do you think she said?" "I want to hear it from you." It was quiet between them for a moment. "They say I ran," Gideon said. Flat. Just the words. "In the war. That I left people behind." He said it the way you say something that's been said at you for so long, it's become a kind of old wound. Not fresh, not unfelt, but incorporated. "That's the story." Levi's jaw was tight. "And is it true?" Gideon looked at his grandson for a long moment. "No," he said. "It is not true." The table was quiet. Nathan Crow said, "No," also, quietly and with absolute finality, in the voice of a witness. Levi picked up his soda. He held it in both hands and looked at the table for a moment, and when he looked back up, there was something behind his eyes that was doing work. Grief, maybe, or anger, or the particular pain of a 17-year-old learning that the world has been unkind to someone they love in ways they weren't told about. "Then why didn't you—" He stopped. Tried again. "Why didn't you say something? Why did you just let them say it?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. The question was fair and it deserved an honest answer, not a tidy one. "Because the man it would have hurt most to correct," he said slowly, "was someone I didn't want to hurt." Levi frowned. "Who?" Gideon didn't answer immediately. He looked out across the park, at the crowd still moving through the afternoon light, at the distant gleam of the steel plate out in the pasture. He looked at something that wasn't quite there, or was there, and just only visible to him. "That's a longer answer," he said, "and it involves your father." The words landed quietly. Everything after them went still. Levi's father had been dead for 4 years. A truck accident on a highway outside San Antonio, in February, in rain. He'd been 39 years old. His name had been James, and he'd been complicated, and the boy missed him with the specific jagged grief of someone who'd loved a person they hadn't entirely finished understanding. "My dad," Levi said. Not a question. A response. Yes. What about him? Gideon looked at his grandson again. He'd been moving toward this moment for a long time, maybe years, maybe longer. And now that it was here, he felt the weight of it, the way you feel the weight of a door you've been keeping closed. Not because the thing behind the door is dangerous, but because once you open it, you can't close it again. Your father knew the truth, Gideon said, about what happened and about who spread the lie. Levi's face shifted. And he kept it, Gideon continued. For reasons I understand, even if I don't fully, he paused. Even if I've not always been at peace with them. Who spread the lie? Levi asked. His voice was low. There was something careful in it. The care of someone who suspects the answer might be something they can't give back once they've received it. Before Gideon could answer, Dalton Mercer appeared at the edge of the table. He didn't sit. He stood there in the afternoon light with his hat in his hands, literally in his hands, held down at his sides, which was something Levi had never seen Dalton do in any of the years he'd been peripherally aware of the man. Dalton Mercer was the kind of person who walked into rooms. He didn't stand at the edge of them holding his hat. He looked at Nathan Crow. Something passed between them that Levi couldn't read. I found out this morning, Dalton said. His voice had lost the easy authority it normally carried. What was underneath was something rawer. Or, I confirmed it this morning. I'd suspected for a while. There were things my father said toward the end that didn't quite... He stopped. It doesn't matter how I came to know. The point is that I know. He looked at Gideon. My father started the rumor, Dalton said. About you. I don't know exactly when. A long time ago. I think, from what I've been able to piece together, I think he couldn't live with something that happened, and instead of... He stopped again, and this time it took him longer to start again. Instead of owning what he felt, he buried it, under a story about you. The table was very quiet. Levi was looking at Dalton with an expression that was not quite comprehension yet, but moving toward it. Your father, Gideon said to Dalton, carefully, saved my life once. Did you know that? Dalton's jaw moved. No. We were in the same unit for about 8 months. He was 19 years old and he was braver than he knew. There was an ambush. It was a bad situation. He got me out of it. Gideon said it matter-of-factly, the way you describe something that was real and difficult and is now a fact. I owed him more than I could repay, and he spent the rest of his life, apparently, unable to carry that debt. Dalton was standing very still. Some people, Gideon said, can't hold gratitude. It feels too much like weakness. And when gratitude starts to feel like weakness, sometimes it curdles into something else. He looked at the younger man. I'm not saying that to excuse what he did. I'm saying it because you deserve to understand it. Not just the fact of it, but the shape of it. Dalton was quiet for a long moment. The hat in his hands moved slightly, his fingers working the brim in a way that looked involuntary. I'm sorry, he said, for what it's worth, and I know it's not worth enough. I'm sorry. On behalf of... He stopped. I'm sorry. Nathan Crow had been watching all of this with the careful, contained attention of a man who spent his life being present at important moments and has learned that the most important thing you can sometimes do is stay quiet and let the moment be what it is. Levi was sitting very still. He was looking at his grandfather, and Gideon was looking back at him, at this boy who had his son's eyes and his own long-limbed frame and a whole life in front of him that would be shaped, at least partly, by what happened today. And his expression had something in it that was not quite relief. And not quite grief, but somewhere between them, in the territory of things that have been held for a very long time. What are you thinking? Gideon asked. Levi looked down at the table. He looked at his hands. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet there was the sound of the park around them. Kids running, music, the distant smell of brisket smoke, the ordinary texture of an Independence Day afternoon. I'm thinking, Levi said finally, that I didn't know the half of who you are. He said it without performance, the way you say something when you mean it more than you know how to express. And it landed quietly in the space between them. Gideon looked at his grandson for a moment. Then he picked up his fork. Eat your food, he said. It's getting cold. And the afternoon continued around them, ordinary and not ordinary, carrying all of it forward into whatever came next. Dalton left the table the way he'd come to it, without ceremony, without the usual performance of exit that characterized most of his movements through public space. He just walked away. And the walking had something diminished in it, Not in a broken way, but in the way of a man who has put something down that he'd been carrying for longer than he realized, and is now recalibrating his balance. Nathan Crow watched him go. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Someone had brought him one. He couldn't remember who, and he was quiet for a moment in the way of someone deciding whether to continue a thing or let it rest. "He's going to have a hard few days," Nathan said. "Yes," Gideon said. "You feel sorry for him?" Gideon considered that honestly. "I feel sorry for the situation," he said, "which is different." Nathan nodded. He understood the distinction. There's a kind of sorrow that's about the person, and a kind that's about the shape of things. The way events compound over years into structures that end up hurting people who weren't even part of the original decision. Dalton hadn't started the lie. He'd inherited it the way you inherit a leaning fence. You didn't build it wrong, but now it's yours to deal with. Levi had been quiet since the conversation with Dalton. He'd eaten the rest of his brisket with the mechanical focus of someone who needs something ordinary to do with their body, while their mind works through something that isn't ordinary at all. He'd finished the food and was now turning his empty soda can in slow circles on the table, which was the 17-year-old version of the thing adults do with coffee cups. "You never fought back," Levi said to his grandfather. Not accusatory, more like a person narrating their own process of understanding. "Not once. In all the years they were saying it, you didn't say anything to anyone." "No." "That must have been hard." Gideon looked at him. "Some of it was," he said. "Which part wasn't?" The old man thought about it, genuinely thought about it, in the way he did most things, without hurry, without filling the silence prematurely. "The part where I knew who I was didn't require them to know it too," he said. "That part was never hard." Levi turned the soda can. "But the part where people treated you a certain way, that part was harder," Gideon admitted. "Especially when it started affecting people around me." Levi looked up. "Like my dad." Gideon met his eyes. "Like your dad?" "Yes." It was here that Nathan Crow decided to fill in what Gideon hadn't yet, partly because he'd been waiting long enough, and partly because there are things that are easier to hear from someone who isn't in the direct line of the pain. He set his coffee cup down. "Your father grew up knowing two things," Nathan said to Levi, careful with his words but direct with them. He knew the rumor about his grandfather because it was in the water of this town by the time he was old enough to hear it, and he knew, at some point, that it wasn't true. Levi was very still. "He found out the truth when he was about 20, Nathan continued. "Your grandfather told him, sat him down and told him the whole of it, what happened in that valley, what his own father had done, where the lie came from. James was angry, very angry. He wanted to—" Nathan paused. "He wanted to correct the record, loudly and publicly, and in a way that would have named names." "Why didn't he?" Levi asked. Nathan looked at Gideon. Gideon leaned his forearms on the table. "Because I asked him not to," he said. "Your grandfather on the other side, Dalton's father, was alive then. He was an old man. He had a son who didn't know what he'd done, and a reputation in this town that, whatever he deserved, had people who depended on it. The ranch employed 40 people." He looked at his hands. "And he and we'd been through something together, real something. What he did to me afterward was wrong. I'm not saying it wasn't, but what he did in that valley, when we were both young and scared and the situation was very bad, that was real too. People are more than the worst thing they do." Levi sat with that for a moment. "So you protected him?" "I protected the situation," Gideon said. "There's a difference. I didn't do it for him. I did it because burning everything down didn't seem like it would leave anything worth standing in. And my dad agreed to that?" "Eventually." Gideon's voice shifted slightly, just slightly. "He wasn't happy about it. He thought I was wrong. We argued about it more than once." He looked out at the park. "He was a stubborn man, your father." "Yeah," Levi said. "He was. He got it from somewhere." It was close enough to a joke that Levi almost smiled, and not quite close enough that he did. Nathan finished his coffee. He set the cup down with the deliberateness of a man who is about to say the next thing, which is the harder thing. "What I want you to understand, Levi, is that your father's silence was not weakness. It was loyalty to your grandfather's choice, even when he disagreed with it. That's a harder thing than most people ever have to do. Defer to someone else's decision about your own life, when you think they're wrong." He looked at the boy directly. "He did that for 20 years. He never told anyone, not even your mother. Levi absorbed this. Something moved through his face that was several things at once. Grief for his father, a kind of retroactive understanding that was reorganizing something inside him, and underneath all of it, a specific kind of pain that you only feel about people who are gone and can't be talked to anymore about what you've just learned. He should have told me, Levi said quietly. He was going to, Gideon said. When you were older, that's what he told me the last time we talked about it. He paused. He was waiting until you were old enough to carry it without it crushing you. And then he was gone, Levi said. And then he was gone. The table was quiet. Around them, the park went on being a park on Independence Day, alive and loud and full of people who had no idea what was being said at this particular table, and whose obliviousness was neither cruel nor kind, just ordinary, which is its own kind of mercy. It was Nathan who finally broke the silence, and he broke it by doing something he'd been meaning to do for 2 hours. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He was one of the few people in the park wearing a jacket, in July, which said something about his personal standards, and he produced a folded piece of paper. I wrote this 3 weeks ago, he said, placing it on the table between them. After I heard about what happened at Levi's school, I wrote it because I wanted to have it ready when the time came. He looked at Gideon. It's a statement. What I witnessed, what I know, my name, my badge number for my service, the date, a notary stamp. He tapped the paper once. It's documentation, Gideon. It puts on record what actually happened and where the lie originated. It names the source. Gideon looked at the paper without picking it up. You can do whatever you want with it, Nathan said. File it, bury it, hand it to Dalton. I don't care, but I wanted you to have it. I wanted it to exist in the world in a form that means something. The old man looked at the paper for a long moment. Then he reached out and picked it up. He unfolded it slowly and read it. All of it. Not skimming, actually reading. In the deliberate way he did things. Nathan watched him read. Levi watched his grandfather read. The crowd moved around them in the July heat. When Gideon finished, he folded it carefully and held it. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me. It's 40 years too late. You said what I asked you not to say, for 40 years, Gideon said. That's not nothing. Nathan's jaw tightened briefly. I'm not sure it was the right call. It wasn't yours to make, Gideon said, gently but clearly. At the time. Now it is. I understand that. I'm not fighting it. Nathan studied him. You've known for a while that this was coming. The situation, Levi getting older, being in the school system here, people saying things. He paused. Did you come here today for the shot or for this? Gideon was quiet for a moment, then, both. The answer sat there, honest and insufficient simultaneously, which is how the most honest answers tend to sit. It was around this point that Dust Hollow began to do the thing that small towns do when something significant has happened in their midst. The slow, cell-to-cell communication that doesn't require a broadcast because proximity does the work. People were talking. People who had been at the range and seen the shot were talking to people who hadn't been, and those people were talking to other people. And the story was moving through the park with the speed and distorting properties of things that travel by word of mouth. Some of it was accurate. A 71-year-old man had shot a .22 at 400 yards and struck a target that no one had ever hit in the 32-year history of the event. That part stayed mostly intact in the retelling, because it was extraordinary enough that embellishment would only diminish it. Some of it was less accurate. The reasons he'd done it, what it meant, who he was, those parts acquired the usual mutations. Someone had heard he used to be some kind of special operations marksman. Someone else had heard he was a former Olympic shooter. Both were wrong, though the truth, had they known it, was arguably more interesting. And threading through it all, surfacing in the conversations of people who'd been in Dust Hollow long enough to have heard the old stories, was the name and the whisper that had followed it for decades. Gideon Mercer. And alongside that whisper, for the first time, a different kind of question. Not the comfortable certainty of a rumor that's been believed so long it feels like fact, but something more unstable. Something that happens to the ground under your feet when you find out it was built on something shakier than you thought. Bobby Pruitt was at the center of one of these conversations, which was both natural and uncomfortable for him. Because Bobby had always been someone who trafficked in local knowledge and certainty, and today his certainty about at least one thing had taken a visible hit. He was standing with 3 other men near the drink tables, and they were doing the thing where everyone is processing a shared experience by talking around it rather than directly at it. You've got to give him credit, one of the men, a younger guy named Terrence, who managed the feed store, was saying. Whatever else you say about the man, that was a shot. It was a hell of a shot, another man agreed. Bobby was quiet, which was itself notable. Bobby, Terrence said, you were up front. You saw the whole thing. What was it like when the shot went in? Bobby looked at his beer. He was a large, affable man who had built much of his social identity on having opinions and sharing them, and right now he was experiencing the specific discomfort of a person whose opinion supply has been interrupted. It was... He stopped. I don't know what it was exactly. He said it in a way that was honest and a little raw at the edges. I was laughing at him 20 minutes before. I said something. He looked at Terrence. You were there. You heard what I said. I heard. I said it loud enough that he could hear it too. Bobby wrapped both hands around his bottle. And he didn't even look at me. He just sat there doing what he was doing. Nobody said anything for a moment. I'm not going to pretend that didn't bother me, Bobby said, which was, for Bobby, the kind of directness about his own behavior that came at cost. Because it should bother me. Hector Vega had been standing at the edge of this group without quite being part of it, which was his usual mode of occupying shared social space. He'd been listening with his arms crossed and his hunter's quietness. The thing people keep getting wrong, Hector said, which caused the other men to turn and acknowledge him properly for the first time, is they keep saying it was luck. I've been hearing that all afternoon, that the wind just happened to cooperate. Wasn't it partly luck? Terrence asked, genuinely. No. Hector was flat about it. Luck would have been if he'd taken the shot at minute 1 and the wind happened to drop. He sat there for 17 minutes, in full sun, with 200 people laughing at him, and he waited for exactly the window he needed. That's not luck. That's something else entirely. Bobby nodded slowly. That's what got me, he said. The waiting. I've been shooting since I was 12, and I cannot sit behind a rifle for 17 minutes. I've tried. My mind goes somewhere else. He looked at his bottle. His didn't. Hector said nothing because he thought the observation was correct and didn't require his endorsement to stand. On the other side of the park, in a narrower conversation, Dalton Mercer was talking to Cassidy. She was the person on the ranch he trusted most. Not because she'd earned that trust through any single dramatic event, but because she'd been consistent over 6 years of working with him, which is a harder thing and ultimately more reliable. She was 31, sharp-minded, and had the particular quality of being able to tell Dalton things he didn't want to hear without making him feel attacked. Talk to me, she said when he found her. He told her. Most of it. The shot, the table, Nathan Crow, and the piece he'd been sitting on since that morning, the piece he'd confirmed from a letter his father had left in a safety deposit box that Dalton had finally opened 6 months ago after avoiding it for 3 years. The letter wasn't a confession, exactly. It was more like the crooked outline of one, his father's attempt to explain something to himself that he'd never managed to put in a form honest enough to actually be an explanation. Cassidy listened the way she always did, without interrupting, without softening her expression into something reassuring. She let him get through it. So your father saved his life, she said when he finished. In the war, yes. And then spent the next 40 years destroying his reputation. Yes. She looked at him. And Gideon knew it was your father, the whole time, and said nothing. Dalton leaned against the truck. Nothing. Cassidy was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? I already apologized. That's a start. She said it without cruelty, but without letting it be enough either. What else? He looked at her. I want to make a public statement. At the ceremony for the prize, I want... People should hear it from me. What my father did. What Gideon actually is. He paused. Nathan Crow's going to say something too, apparently, about what he knows. Dalton, she said his name carefully, are you doing this because it's the right thing to do, or because you want people to see you doing the right thing? He was quiet for long enough that the question got to do its work. Both, probably, he said. But mostly the first one. Mostly? I'm not a saint, Cassidy. I'm trying to do the right thing. That doesn't mean all of my reasons are pure. She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. Okay, she said. That's honest. The prize ceremony was traditionally held at 4 o'clock, under the main canopy near the stage where the evening band would set up later. It was a modest affair. The range officer read out the results, the winner received the belt buckle and the rifle from Harlan Webb's gun shop, and there was a brief round of applause. Usually it took about 8 minutes, and people moved on to other things. This year, the crowd that gathered was about 3 times the usual size. Word had moved efficiently. People knew there was something more than a trophy exchange about to happen. They knew it the way crowds always know, not through announcement, but through the accumulated signal of many small things, the expressions on certain faces, the way specific people had been moving through the park all afternoon, the quality of attention that had been building since a small rifle cracked across a valley and a piece of steel rang for the first time in 32 years. Gideon arrived with Levi beside him and Nathan Crow 2 steps behind. He moved through the gathered crowd with that same unhurried quality. Not performing confidence, just not performing anything, which is a different thing entirely. People made space. Not reverently exactly, but with the instinctive adjustment of a crowd that has updated its understanding of what it's looking at. Levi was close to his grandfather's left side, their arms occasionally brushing as they moved. He was not hiding it. Carl, the range officer, stood at the podium, which was actually just a music stand with a note card on it, and called the ceremony to order with the practiced economy of a man who runs these things every year. He read the results, Gideon's name, the measurement, the fact of the strike. And there was a sound from the crowd that was part applause and part the involuntary noise people make when they're hearing something they still haven't fully processed. He called Gideon forward. Gideon walked to the front, and Harlan Webb, 60 years old, with a craftsman's hands and the respectful quiet of a man who understands the difference between a good tool and a great one, handed over the buckle and the rifle. The rifle was beautiful. There was no other word for it. A hand-finished Winchester with custom woodwork that Harlan had spent 3 months on, because he was the kind of craftsman who doesn't change his standard based on the probability of someone actually winning. The wood was figured walnut, warm, and deep-grained, and the metalwork had a polished dignity that stopped short of showiness. It was a working rifle made by someone who knew that working rifles can also be beautiful. Gideon held it. He looked at it carefully, the way he looked at everything, and what moved across his face was something that wasn't quite the emotion people might have expected. It was quieter than that, more interior. He was still holding it when Dalton stepped forward. Dalton hadn't told Carl he was going to do this. He just moved to the front of the crowd, and Carl, who had good instincts about when to let things happen, stepped back from the music stand without being asked. The crowd went quiet. Dalton stood there in front of 200 and some odd people he'd known most of his life. People who'd watched him grow up, who'd worked for his family, who'd been to his father's funeral. And he held his hat in his hands the same way he'd held it at the table, which was the tell that something genuine was happening underneath the controlled surface. "Most of you know me," he said. He didn't project his voice the way people do when they're performing. He just spoke at the volume required to be heard. "You knew my father. You knew our family. And most of you, for a long time, have known a story about Gideon Mercer." The crowd didn't move. "I found out 6 months ago," Dalton said, "that my father started that story." He said it clearly and without preface, the way you deliver a thing that you've decided has to be delivered cleanly or not at all. "I found out from something he left behind. A letter that wasn't quite an apology and wasn't quite an explanation, but was enough that I could read what he'd done and understand it." He looked at the ground for a moment, then back up. "What happened was this," he said. "In the war, a long time ago, my father was in a situation where he should have died. Gideon Mercer got him out. My father owed him his life." He paused. And he couldn't carry that. Some men can't. The debt was too heavy, and what he did with the weight of it was, he told a story that turned Gideon into something less than he was, something that my father could feel better than, instead of grateful to. His jaw tightened. He was wrong. He was profoundly wrong. And I'm sorry. To Gideon Mercer, in front of this town, on behalf of my family, I am sorry. The silence after that was the kind that cost people something to maintain, because the instinct in a crowd is to fill silence, and people were suppressing that instinct because the silence felt earned and necessary. Nathan Crow stepped forward then. He'd been a marshal for 28 years, and he had the particular authority of a man who spent decades being the person a room turns toward when it needs to know the truth of a thing. He stood at the front without a note card, without a prepared statement. He'd written the statement for Gideon, not for this. And what he said here came from a different place. "I was there," he said, "in that valley, with a different unit, but close enough to know what happened. I've kept quiet about it for a long time, at Gideon's request, and that was his right to ask, and my choice to honor." He looked at the crowd steadily. "But I'll tell you plainly now. What people have said about Gideon Mercer, for as long as people have been saying it, is false. He did not run. He did not leave anyone. What he actually did, Nathan paused, and something in his face tightened. What he actually did is the kind of thing that doesn't get told in places like this, at events like this, because the people who do those things tend not to talk about them. They just carry them home and get on with it. He looked at Gideon. He trained soldiers, Nathan said. Young men who didn't know enough to stay alive. He kept them alive. More than I can count over the years I observed his service. And the one life he probably saved most decisively, he glanced at Dalton, belonged to the man who repaid him with slander. The crowd absorbed this. Levi was standing to Gideon's left, and something was happening in his face that was beyond his control, which was all right. He was 17, and he was hearing, for the first time and from public testimony, the full shape of who his grandfather was and what had been done to him. The emotion that produced is not a thing you manage at 17. You just carry it and try not to let it drop. Gideon looked at Nathan when he finished. He nodded once. Something passed between them that had the quality of a long overdue thing finally becoming past tense. Then Gideon turned to the crowd. He didn't speak immediately. He stood there for a moment, holding the beautiful rifle in his hands, looking at the faces of people he'd known for most of his adult life, people who'd believed a story about him, many of whom had treated him accordingly, some of whom were now looking at him with expressions that carried the particular discomfort of understanding that you've been wrong about someone for a long time. I'm not going to tell you how to feel about what you've just heard, he said. His voice was even. That's between you and yourselves. He looked down at the rifle, ran a thumb along the grain of the wood. I appreciate this. The shot it was a good day, and I appreciate that Harlan put this much work into something that was supposed to be a long shot of ever being given out. There was a small ripple of something through the crowd. Not laughter exactly, but the release that happens when tension is given a small, careful exit. I'm going to do something with this that might seem unusual, Gideon said. He turned and looked at the crowd until he found the face he was looking for. Wyatt Boone. Come here. There was a stir. The young shooter from Marble Falls, who had been standing near the back of the crowd with the uncomfortable look of someone who doesn't know if they belong in the front part of a moment, straightened slightly. Come up here, Gideon said. Simple. No theater. Wyatt moved through the crowd, which parted for him with the slightly bewildered compliance of a group that is following the authority of someone who clearly knows what they're doing, even if the crowd doesn't entirely see it yet. He stopped in front of Gideon. He was a head shorter and about 48 years younger, and he looked like he'd been handed a situation he wasn't sure he'd prepared for. Gideon held the rifle out to him. Wyatt looked at it, then at the old man, then at the rifle again. Sir, you identified the secondary wind layer, Gideon said, while you were watching, without being told to look for it, and without the benefit of 50 years of practice. That's instinct. That's the part I can't teach. He extended the rifle another inch. The rest I can teach, but not if you don't have that. Wyatt's throat moved. Take it, Gideon said. The younger man took the rifle. He held it with the care of someone who understands what they're holding, which meant he understood it was not just a rifle. The crowd watched. It was one of those moments that arrives without announcement and leaves people changed in ways they can't immediately account for. Not dramatically changed, not in the ways that movies tend to portray change, but shifted, the way furniture shifts a room. The same elements, slightly different arrangement, and somehow everything feels different. Levi was watching his grandfather's face as the rifle changed hands, and what he saw there was not sacrifice or loss or the performance of generosity. It was something quieter and more durable than any of those things. It was someone who knew exactly who they were and had known for a long time, giving away a thing they didn't need in order to move a thing that mattered forward. Gideon turned back to the crowd. That's all I've got, he said, as simply as that. He stepped back from the music stand. He found Levi beside him, as he'd been beside him all day, and he put a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. Levi put his hand over it for a moment, and neither of them said anything, because there are things between people that words are insufficient for, and this was one of them. Behind them, the crowd found its voice again, slowly and unevenly, the way voices return after the kind of silence that asks something of the people who hold it. Bobby Pruitt was somewhere in the middle of the crowd, and he was clapping. He was clapping hard enough that his palms were going to feel it later, and his face had the look of a man who is trying to make up for something with the sincerity of his applause, which is not nothing, even if it is not everything. Hector Vega was also clapping. He did it with the same economy he brought to everything, steady, deliberate, without excess. He was watching Wyatt Boone hold the rifle, and he was thinking something that showed on his face, though he wouldn't have said it aloud, which was that he had come here today expecting an afternoon he'd seen before, and instead the afternoon had shown him something he intended to think about for a while. Dalton Mercer was standing slightly apart from the crowd. He was not clapping. He was looking at Gideon with an expression that was genuinely difficult to read. Not hostile, not grateful exactly, not relieved. Something more unresolved than any of those things, which was probably appropriate, because what had just happened was not the kind of thing that resolves in an afternoon. It was the beginning of a resolution, which is different and harder. The ceremony drifted to its close, as ceremonies do. People began to move. The light was shifting toward late afternoon, and the band would set up soon, and the evening portion of the 4th of July would begin its own rhythms. Life was pressing forward the way it always does, around and through and past whatever has just happened, because life doesn't pause for reckoning. Gideon stood at the edge of it all and watched it begin to move, and felt the particular quality of a day that has done what it came to do. Even if what it came to do was never precisely planned, even if it arrived sideways and cost more than expected and left certain things still unresolved and probably always would. He was still holding the belt buckle. He turned it over in his hands. It was heavy gold plate over brass, and the engraving read 400 yards, dust hollow, and then the year. He looked at it for a moment, and then he looked up. Levi was beside him. "You gave away the rifle," the boy said. "I've got a rifle," Gideon said. "The buckle too?" Gideon looked at the buckle. Then he held it out, flat in his palm. Levi looked at it. "Me? Your father should have been here today," Gideon said. The words were even, but underneath the evenness was something that cost him. "He's not. You are. This is yours." Levi took the buckle. He held it in both hands, looking at it, and what moved through his face was something complicated and private enough that it would be wrong to fully describe it. He closed his fingers around it. They stood there for a moment, the two of them, in the late afternoon of an Independence Day in Dust Hollow, Texas, while the world moved around them in its ordinary and extraordinary way. The old man's knee was hurting. It had been since the morning, from the sitting and the standing and the walking, and he hadn't said anything about it because there was nothing to say. He shifted his weight slightly and looked at his grandson and thought about his son, and about the shape of the years, and about the fact that the wind in that valley had finally done exactly what he'd read it to do, on a day when it needed to. That was enough. The band started setting up around 5, the way they always did. 3 guys from Kerrville who played country and classic rock, and occasionally crossed into territory that didn't cleanly belong to either, which most people in Dust Hollow didn't mind because by 5 o'clock the beer had been flowing long enough that the distinction between genres felt less important. They ran cables and adjusted microphones and did sound checks with the particular unhurried efficiency of musicians who've played enough outdoor events to know that the acoustics are going to be imperfect regardless of how much time you spend on them. Gideon watched them from a distance, standing near the tree line at the east edge of the park, where the shade was deepest and the crowd thinned to something manageable. His knee was bad enough now that standing in one place was preferable to moving, and the tree he'd found to lean against was an old live oak that had probably been there longer than the event itself. He'd taken his hat off and was holding it at his side, feeling the slight drop in temperature that comes with shade in the late Texas afternoon, which is modest but real. Levi had gone to get water. He'd been gone about 4 minutes, which Gideon was aware of without particularly tracking the way you're aware of someone you care about when they move out of your immediate vicinity. The boy had been close to him all afternoon with the instinctive protectiveness that sometimes runs backward in families. The younger generation sheltering the older one, which Gideon would never ask for and privately found both moving and slightly inconvenient. He was thinking about the drive home, about the particular silence that would be in the truck, which would be a different silence than the one on the way in, heavier in some ways, lighter in others, carrying more than it had this morning. He was thinking about what he'd cook for dinner because Levi hadn't eaten enough at the park, and growing teenagers need actual meals, not just brisket and a soda. He was thinking about these ordinary things because ordinary things are what you hold on to after a day that has cost something, and cost him it had, even if it was cost he'd chosen. He heard footsteps and looked up, expecting Levi. It was Dalton. The younger man came to the tree line without announcing himself, which took a certain kind of nerve, and he stopped about 6 feet away in the manner of someone who's decided the conversation needs to happen, but hasn't fully worked out the opening. He had a bottle of water in each hand, not as a prop, just because he'd picked them up on the way, which was a small human detail that made him seem more like a person and less like a problem to be managed. He held one out. Gideon took it. They stood there for a moment in the shade of the live oak with the sound of the band's soundcheck in the background, a guitar running through scales and then stopping, running, and stopping, which is a sound that exists nowhere except the setup phase of outdoor events and carries a specific kind of ordinary American summer attached to it. I keep starting sentences, Dalton said, and then stopping them. I noticed, because everything I want to say sounds either insufficient or like I'm trying to make myself feel better. Probably both things are true, Gideon said. That doesn't mean the thing shouldn't be said. Dalton looked at him. There was something in the quality of that look, direct, stripped of the usual social performance, that was easier to deal with than the performance had ever been. I keep thinking about the letter, my father's letter. He paused. He wrote about the valley, about what happened. He didn't describe it in detail, but enough. And there was a line. He wrote, Dalton stopped and looked away briefly, at the band, at nothing, before coming back. He wrote that you pulled him out of a position that he should not have survived. Those were his words. Should not have survived. Gideon said nothing. And then in the next paragraph, Dalton continued, he was describing why he'd started telling people what he told them. About you. His jaw tightened. He called it, I remember the exact phrase, he called it getting even with the debt, like the debt was something done to him, like owing you his life was something you'd done wrong. He shook his head slightly. I've read it 4 times, and I still can't entirely... It makes sense, Gideon said. Dalton looked at him sharply. Not as a moral matter, Gideon clarified. I'm not saying it was right. I'm saying the psychology of it makes sense. There are men, good men, sometimes, in other respects, who genuinely cannot bear to be in someone's debt. It creates a kind of... It corrodes something in them. And when it corrodes long enough, he turned the water bottle in his hands. The easiest thing becomes making the person you owe into someone you don't need to feel grateful to. Dalton was quiet for a long moment. The guitar ran through scales again. Someone tapped a microphone. He was never easy, Dalton said finally. My father, he was a difficult man. I loved him, but he seemed to be selecting words carefully. There was always something underneath him that I couldn't reach, some room I was never allowed in. I assumed it was just his generation, men who didn't talk about things. Now I think it was specifically this. He looked at Gideon. He carried this for 40 years. He did. Does knowing why he did it change anything? For you? It was an honest question, asked with the genuine uncertainty of a man who isn't sure whether he wants the answer to be yes or no. Gideon thought about it, properly thought about it, in the way he did most things, not rushing to the comfortable response. It changes the texture of it, he said. It doesn't change what happened. What was said about me and the years of it and what it cost Levi's father. That doesn't get undone by understanding the reason. He looked at Dalton. But understanding why a wrong thing happened is still worth something. It keeps it from being just senseless, which is its own kind of darkness. Dalton absorbed this. He was not a man who'd had many conversations in this register. Honest, careful, without an angle. And he was navigating it with the slight awkwardness of someone working in a mode they haven't fully developed. I'm going to do something, Dalton said. Beyond what I said today, formally. I talked to Nathan Crow about it. He paused. There's a veterans memorial on the county grounds. There's been a proposal for years to add a second recognition panel for service members from this county who served in conflicts after the main memorial was built. It's been stalled because of funding. He looked at Gideon steadily. I'm going to fund it, fully. And I'm going to make sure your name is on it, with your actual record, what you actually did. Gideon was quiet. You don't have to say yes, Dalton said. I'm doing it regardless. It's not contingent on It's not a trade. I just wanted you to know. All right, Gideon said. All right, you'll allow it? Or all right, you heard me? Both, Dalton nodded. He looked like he'd expected more resistance and wasn't quite sure what to do with the absence of it. He looked at the band for a moment, then back. My father, whatever he did, he was also a man who built something real. The ranch is real. The people who work on it, their lives, their families, that's real. He said it like a man reminding himself of something he needs to hold on to. He wasn't only what he did to you. No, Gideon said. He wasn't. I'm not asking you to... I know what you're not asking, Gideon said. He said it not unkindly. I'm not required to have a simple feeling about a complicated man. Neither are you. Something in Dalton's face shifted. A release, minor, but visible. Like a door that's been braced against pressure, and the pressure is eased enough that the bracing isn't necessary anymore. Can I ask you something? Dalton said. You can ask. In the valley. What he did. What he actually did when the situation was... He paused. Was he brave? My father. In that moment, was he actually brave? Gideon looked at him for a long moment. Yes, he said, simply and without hesitation. He was 19 years old and he was scared half to death and he came anyway. That's the definition, as far as I'm aware. Dalton's throat moved. Whatever he did afterward, Gideon said, that part was real. That's worth holding on to. The younger man nodded. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was doing the internal thing that people do when they're trying to manage something that wants to surface in their face, and they're in public and it's complicated. He managed it, mostly. Thank you, he said. Gideon just nodded. Dalton left the tree line and walked back into the park, and Gideon watched him go with the particular attention of a man who spent a long time reading people, not judging, just watching, the way you watch wind flags, looking for the truth of the movement underneath the surface motion. Levi came back with 2 bottles of water, one of which he'd already drunk half of. He stopped when he saw Dalton's retreating figure. Was that him again? Yes. Levi handed over the full bottle. What did he want? To say some more things that needed saying. The boy looked at his grandfather's face, which was arranged in its usual steady way, which told him approximately nothing about what was happening underneath it, which was both frustrating and, at this point, completely predictable. Are you all right? My knee hurts, Gideon said. That's not what I asked. I know. Levi leaned against the oak beside him. They were quiet for a moment, which was a comfortable kind of quiet. The kind built over years of knowing someone well enough that the silences between you don't require explanation. Can I ask you about my dad? Levi said. He said it carefully, the way you pick up something fragile that you're not sure will hold. Yes. The anger he had, about the rumor, about what you asked him to keep quiet. Did you two fight about it? Like, actually fight? Gideon exhaled. Twice, he said. The first time was bad. He said things, and I said things back, and we didn't talk for 3 weeks. He paused. The second time was quieter, worse, in a way, because it was more honest. What did he say? He said he thought I was wrong to protect the silence, that I was teaching him that the truth didn't have to be defended, and that the cost of that lesson would come out somewhere. That it always does. Gideon looked at the middle distance. He was right about that part. I didn't say so at the time. And what did you say? I said that the truth would still be true in 20 years, and if we burned it all down today, the wreckage would be there for 20 years too, and it was better to wait for the right moment. He paused. I said I was asking him to trust me. Did he? Eventually. Gideon turned the water bottle. He told me about a year before the accident. He came out to the property on a Tuesday morning, just showed up, and we sat on the porch and drank coffee, and at some point he said, I think I understand why you did it, even if I don't fully agree. He stopped. That was as close as your father got to saying he was wrong about something. Levi let out a short sound that was almost a laugh. Yeah, that sounds right. He had his grandmother's stubbornness. He had yours. Possibly. The corner of Gideon's mouth shifted. Possibly. They stood together under the oak while the band finished its sound check and began to play. Something slow and country. Recognizable, but not exactly identifiable. The kind of song that functions as background for summer evenings rather than foreground. People were gathering on the grass with chairs and blankets. Children were running again. The smell of food from the competition pits had mellowed into something that was just part of the air now. The way certain smells become the texture of an experience rather than distinct things you notice. It was in this returning to normalcy that the older veterans found them. There were 5 of them, and they arrived without arrangement. 2 from across the park, 1 from the direction of the parking lot, 2 more from somewhere near the food stands. They were men of different ages, different builds, different eras of service. One was probably in his mid-80s, moving slowly on a cane. The youngest was perhaps 55. What they shared was the quality of deliberate movement, the particular physical economy that tends to stay in men who've served, and the shared knowledge that something had happened today that one of their own had been part of. The man on the cane was first. He stopped in front of Gideon and didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at him with the clear, undecorated gaze of a very old man who stopped wasting time on social performance. Korea, the old man said by way of introduction. Vietnam, Gideon said, understanding immediately. The old man nodded. He looked at Gideon for another moment. Then he extended his hand, the cane hand, the right, transferring the cane to his left in a motion that cost him something. And Gideon took it. They shook without grandeur, the kind of handshake that carries content. Good shot, the old man said. Thank you. Good waiting, the old man corrected. The shot was easy by then. Gideon looked at him. It was perhaps the most accurate description of the technical reality that anyone had offered all day. Yes, he said. That's right. The old man nodded once more and moved to the side, not quite leaving but making room for the others. The next man was 60-something, Gulf War era, with the look of someone who'd spent the intervening decades in physical work, weathered in the particular way that outdoor labor produces, which is different from the weathering of stress or age alone. He didn't say much. He shook Gideon's hand and looked at him long enough to communicate something, and Gideon looked back in the same language, and that was the extent of it. The three others came in their own way, each with their own version of the same impulse, to be present, to acknowledge, to register with a man who'd had something significant done to him by the town they all lived in, and who had, in some manner that didn't require explanation, done something today that was about more than shooting. Levi stood slightly behind his grandfather and watched these men come one by one, and what he watched was not sentimentality. It wasn't emotional in the performed way. Nobody was overcome. Nobody made speeches. It was quieter and more durable than that. It was men recognizing each other across years and experience the way people recognize a shared language in a place where that language isn't commonly spoken. It occurred to Levi, standing under that oak tree, that he had spent the last 4 years, since his father died, thinking of his grandfather primarily as an old man with a bad knee and a quiet manner and a property that needed more upkeep than he could manage alone. He had thought of him as someone to look after. He had not, until today, fully understood that he had been looking after someone who had, for decades, been quietly one of the most substantial people in any room he entered. That recalibration was not a comfortable thing entirely. There was something in it that felt like a loss, the loss of the simpler version, the old man version, even though what replaced it was larger. You can love a simplified version of someone and grieve it when the full version arrives, and both things can be true at once. Wyatt Boone appeared at the edge of the group, while the last of the veterans were still there. He'd been carrying the rifle, the walnut-stocked Winchester, in its case, which Harlan Webb had provided, and he held it with the careful two-handed carry of someone who's treating a thing with appropriate gravity. He'd clearly been trying to find the right moment and had decided this was it. The veterans acknowledged him the way they'd acknowledged each other. Briefly, reading him quickly with the eyes of people who've learned to assess the important things fast and waste nothing on the rest. They moved on. Natural, orderly, without discussion. Wyatt waited until it was just the three of them. Him, Gideon, Levi, and then he stood there for a moment in the way he'd stood at the refreshment table earlier, which was the way of a man who needs to say something and is building to it properly. I can't just take this, he said. He meant the rifle. You already did, Gideon said. I mean, I can't take it without... He stopped. Without saying what it means, what you doing that means, to me specifically. He said it with the directness that comes from someone young enough to not yet have built up all the social armor that keeps people from saying the real thing. Gideon looked at him. He waited. My grandfather left me his rifle when he died, Wyatt said. An old Remington. Nothing fancy. But he'd shot it for 40 years and the stock had his hands in it. You know what I mean? The wear of it was him. He swallowed. I've been shooting with it for 2 years, and I still can't... He paused again, choosing. I can't feel like I'm good enough to deserve it, like I've earned being the next person to carry it. He looked at the case in his hands. And then you... He gestured slightly, not quite finishing the sentence. I don't know why you picked me. There were 100 people here, but you looked through that crowd and you said my name and you gave me this. He looked at Gideon. I just want you to know that I understand it's not just a rifle, and I won't treat it like it is. Gideon was quiet for a moment. The band was playing something livelier now, and the park had found its evening rhythm. My grandfather gave me a rifle, Gideon said. A Winchester, different model. I was 22. I'd just come back from my first deployment, and I thought I knew more than I did, which is the standard condition of being 22 and having survived something. He paused. He sat me down and gave me the rifle, and he said, he was not a man of many words. He said, "The rifle is the easy part. What you put behind it is the hard part, and you spend your whole life working on that." Wyatt listened. He was right. Obviously. Gideon looked at him steadily. "You already know the hard part matters more than the easy part. You stayed when everyone else was laughing, and you watched and you tried to understand. That's the hard part.